Russian propaganda and disinformation. I saw you nodding along, so I want to get your reaction. But also I want to talk to you about the fact that the British government is now saying that Russian internet trolls based in St. Petersburg are targeting world leaders online, that they're spreading support for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. You know, initially, many had considered that Russia was losing the information war when it came to propaganda about Ukraine. Is that changing at this point?
So there's a few things to tease out here. I don't necessarily share the same kind of optimism of Romeo around the resilience of the information sphere outside of Ukraine. We've certainly seen real concerted attempts from pro-Kremlin forces to push their narratives elsewhere on social media, in mainstream media, in various other spaces. So, for example, in the aftermath of the Bucha atrocities, when they came out, ISD did a study, looked at the 200 sort of posts which were most shared across Facebook in 20 different countries, and found that while a minority of them, about 55, were disputing the kind of true account of what happened in Bucha, they were more shared than the other 145 combined. And so there's still quite a lot that social media platforms and tech companies need to do to try to clean up the information ecosystem and make it more resilient to the kinds of narratives and propaganda that are coming out of the Kremlin. In terms of your second question around whether we or the West are winning the information war, I think it's a complex picture. So obviously around the beginning of the war, you had a lot of people say that Zelensky in particular was doing extremely well, and Ukraine more broadly. That was taken as quite a Western-oriented view. And if you look at some of the studies coming out of ISD and elsewhere, you can see that there are real inroads being made in a lot of non-Anglosphere communities by the Kremlin. So, for example, RT in Arabic is doing extremely well. If you look in a number of other countries, you can see this across the social media landscape as well. So while it may be the case that in the West they're doing reasonably well, Russia is attempting to push its narratives and win the information war on a number of different fronts, and we can't afford to let our guard down there.
So, Tim, you heard Rebecca there talk about the fact that these online spaces, from her vantage point, need more regulation. I also heard Romeo talk about that there should be frameworks put in place to help safeguard information that's out there. I want to ask you, there's growing calls for countries to adopt legal frameworks and systems to protect information online, to counter disinformation. Of course, one example Rebecca mentioned, the DSA with the EU. But do you think that we're going to see more of this? Is this trend going to continue? Are there countries out there that are going to be setting up systems or passing legislation in order to do this?
Well, it's absolutely necessary for these kinds of regulatory frameworks to be introduced. And I just want to give a quick word about what they need to look like, as well as the fact that they need to exist. Because up until now, we've both relied upon platforms to moderate themselves and also taken a really piecemeal approach to content moderation, which looks at specific pieces of content or types of content and tries to remove them, rather than examining the underlying business models of the companies, rather than looking at how their own models and how their own algorithms can encourage the kinds of problems that we're seeing. So what we really need is a systemic approach which allows us, for example, as researchers, to access data, to encourage rigorous levels of transparency so that we can see just how big the problems are and how they are functioning. Because all this data shouldn't be in-house at tech companies, it should be available for scrutiny by those who are qualified to look at it. And so we need to make sure that these regulatory frameworks enshrine that in law. And I really do hope that in addition to the DSA, in addition to the Online Safety Bill, that other countries with clout and with large numbers of users in them start to adopt these, because the power that they have is directly proportional to how much of the market of a tech company is regulated. So the DSA in Europe means much more, for example, than the Online Safety Bill in the UK. If the US were to introduce similar kinds of legislation, that would have much more power still, partly because of these companies being based primarily in Silicon Valley. And then, I guess, if I may, a word about TikTok, which is a bit of a problem because of the fact that it is Chinese owned. It doesn't have the same kinds of regulation or accessibility as nearly any other platform. It's the most opaque. You basically have to do any kind of research on it manually. We have no conception of the scale of the problem on there, but the manual qualitative research that we have done shows that there are huge amounts of propaganda being pumped onto the platform from state actors and non-state actors alike. Margarita Simonian, the editor of Russia Today or RT, has an extremely popular account on there, even with RT and Sputnik being banned. It's important to note that this platform in particular has become a massive new vector for disinformation, and we really need to do something about that.
Tim, the UN has said that online attacks on journalists and information are eroding trust. From your vantage point, how bad are things getting?
I think that's extremely important to note, because fact-checking is one thing, and so is stopping frivolous or overly litigious lawsuits. But we have to address the root cause of this, which is, at least to some degree, that trust in journalism, trust in democratic institutions, trust in electoral processes is really being eroded on a systematic level by a variety of actors. And the demand side of disinformation isn't being addressed either. So it's not just that people are being supplied a range of different narratives from a range of different bad actors. It's also that they are looking for that kind of information because in many ways, a lot of things in the world feel like they're getting worse. People feel like they can't trust authorities. And so consequently, they end up looking for things which make totalizing conclusions about the world, which see it in black and white terms, which often appeal to conspiracy theories, because those give them more satisfying explanations than many of the real mechanisms which underpin the way the world works. And so that's deeply problematic. And we know that many regimes and also many governments and political parties in states are engaging in these sorts of campaigns to undermine trust. We saw it during the Trump years in the US. We see it with Russia right now. We see it with, for example, North African regimes like the Eritrean regime. We see it in Eastern Europe, with Hungary, or Central Europe rather. And that's deeply problematic. So I think we are in a really quite dire state right now with respect to the amount of trust that we place in journalists and the amount of attacks that happen in the online space, as well as offline, as well as the sort of prosecutions and other kinds of lawsuits.
Thanks so much to all of our guests, Rebecca Vincent, Romeo Kokriatsky, and Tim Squirrell.